When we think of the ultimate military empires, we usually think of Rome. We think of the disciplined legions, the paved roads, and the conquest of the known world. Or perhaps we think of the Mongols, sweeping across the steppes with speed and brutality. But long before Rome was even a village, and 2,000 years before Genghis Khan was born, there was another empire. One that wrote the handbook on total war. One that terrified the ancient world so deeply that its name became synonymous with the apocalypse. They were the Assyrians. And they didn't just conquer, they professionalized the very act of killing. In the history books, they are often cast simply as villains, the monsters of the Old Testament who destroyed the kingdom of Israel. But to view them only as butchers is to miss the terrifying genius of their civilization. They were the first to treat warfare not as a seasonal activity for farmers, but as a science, an industry, a machine. This is the story of how a small city-state in northern Iraq built the world's first true superpower, revolutionized technology, and ruled through a calculated psychological terror that still echoes today. This is the untold story of the Assyrian war machine. To understand how Assyria became unstoppable, you have to look at how war was fought before them. In the Bronze Age, armies were mostly militias. When the harvest season ended, farmers would pick up spears, fight a few battles, and go home to plant their crops. Wars were limited by the seasons. The Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III changed everything. He looked at this system and realized that to build a true empire, he didn't need farmers. He needed soldiers. He created the world's first standing army. For the first time in history, men were paid to do nothing but train and fight, 365 days a year. While their enemies were worrying about the harvest, the Assyrians were drilling. They developed standardized units, heavy infantry with tall wicker shields, specialized archers, and shock cavalry that replaced the outdated chariots of the past. But discipline was only half the equation. The other half was metal. The Assyrians rose during the Iron Age, and they embraced this new material with terrifying efficiency. While many of their enemies were still using softer bronze weapons, the Assyrians mass-produced iron swords, iron spear tips, and iron armor scales. Imagine the difference on the battlefield. An Assyrian iron sword didn't just hold its edge longer, it shattered bronze shields. They had better logistics, better supply lines, and better weapons. They were fighting a modern war against primitive enemies. In the ancient world, if an invading army approached your city, the strategy was simple: lock the gates and wait. Ancient armies were terrible at sieges. They would surround a city and hope to starve the people out before they themselves ran out of food or died of disease. A good wall made you invincible. The Assyrians looked at a 50-foot stone wall and saw merely an engineering problem. They became the masters of siege warfare. They didn't just wait outside, they brought the walls down. They developed the Corps of Engineers, specialized units that traveled with the army specifically to undermine fortifications. They built massive wheeled siege towers that could be rolled right up to the enemy battlements, allowing archers to fire down into the city while infantry stormed over the top. They used battering rams, but not just simple logs carried by men. These were covered, mobile tanks with iron-tipped heads, hung on chains to swing with rhythmic, devastating force against stone gates. If the walls were too thick, Assyrian sappers would dig tunnels underneath the foundations, collapsing the earth and bringing the stone curtains crashing down. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. For thousands of years, walls meant safety. When the Assyrian army arrived, people realized with horror that their walls were now a prison. There was nowhere to run. But the most potent weapon in the Assyrian arsenal wasn't iron or engineering. It was fear. We often look back at ancient atrocities and think of them as mindless savagery. But for the Assyrians, brutality was state policy. It was propaganda. It was calculated. The Assyrian kings wanted you to know exactly what would happen if you resisted. They carved graphic depictions of their torture onto the walls of their own palaces. They wrote detailed accounts of their cruelty on stone tablets to be read by ambassadors from other nations. King Ashur-nasir-pal II bragged in his inscriptions, "I built a pillar over against his city gate, and I flayed all the chief men who had revolted, and I covered the pillar with their skins." They practiced impalement, mass beheadings, and the deportation of entire populations. But this wasn't just sadism. It was a message. The message was simple: surrender, pay tribute, and you will live. Resist, and you will be erased. It was effective. As the Assyrian army marched toward a city, news of their arrival often caused immediate surrender. Entire kingdoms capitulated without a single arrow being fired, simply because they had heard the stories. The Assyrians conquered the mind before they ever conquered the land. By the 7th century BC, the Assyrian Empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean and down into Egypt. It was the largest empire the world had ever seen. It seemed eternal, but the very things that made Assyria strong eventually killed it. The policy of constant war drained the treasury. The standing army required immense resources, and the strategy of terror created a deep, burning hatred in the hearts of their subjects. They had no allies, only victims waiting for a moment of weakness. That moment came when the Babylonians and the Medes, two peoples who had suffered under the Assyrian boot, formed a coalition. They realized that the Assyrian war machine was overextended. The borders were too wide to defend. In 612 BC, the coalition armies marched on the Assyrian capital of Nineveh. It was the greatest city in the world, a marvel of gardens and aqueducts. The siege lasted 3 months. When the walls finally breached, the pent-up rage of a century was unleashed. Nineveh was sacked so thoroughly, burned so intensely, that within a few generations, people forgot where it had been. When Xenophon and his Greek mercenaries marched past the ruins 200 years later, they saw the massive mounds of earth and didn't even realize they were walking past the grave of the world's first superpower. History is filled with irony. The fire that destroyed the palaces of Nineveh actually saved its greatest treasure. The last great Assyrian king, Ashurbanipal, was not just a warrior, he was a scholar. He had collected all the knowledge of the ancient world, medical texts, astronomy, myths, and history, onto thousands of clay tablets. When the invaders burned the palace, the fire didn't destroy the clay tablets. It baked them. It hardened them into ceramic, preserving them for thousands of years under the sands of Iraq. Because of this, we know the Epic of Gilgamesh. We know the history of the region. The Assyrians, who dedicated their existence to destruction, inadvertently preserved the history of humanity for us. They were the masters of war, the architects of terror, and the first true empire builders. They showed the world what professional warfare looked like, leaving a blueprint that would be picked up by the Persians, then the Greeks, and finally the Romans. The Assyrians proved that an empire could be built on iron and fear, but their fall proved something else: that an empire built only on fear will eventually find itself alone against the world.